Hey everyone, my name is Erica and I'm a traditional media artist, and in today's video I'm going to be sharing with you how I paint a simple and easy landscape using Viviva's watercolor sheets. The supplies you'll be using for today's tutorial are your watercolor set, at least one medium-sized brush. I'm going to be using one size 14 round brush for this entire painting, some sort of paint mixing palette, your watercolor paper, and you're going to see me use scrap pieces of watercolor paper throughout this painting process to test out colors and transparencies before actually going into my painting with them, some sort of rag or absorbent paper towel, and your cup or container of clean water. I have broken apart this landscape into different sections or layers so that I can easily explain this to you, and I always like getting started with painting the sky, which is a layer or the part of the scene that is furthest away from us as the viewer. When I am drawing or painting something like a landscape or some sort of setting, I always like giving thought to what elements are in the foreground, what elements are in the middle ground, and what elements are in the background. Of course, when we're working with watercolors, something else that's super important comes into play that we really need to take into account. You see, if we place paint on wet or damp paper or along the edges of a wet or damp section of paper, that paint is going to dissipate and bleed into the dampness of the paper. Whereas if we're looking to create sharper looking details or sharp edges to the shapes that we start placing, it's important that we paint on dry paper. So give thought to what kinds of effects you want for each layer or section of your landscape so that you can plan accordingly, and make sure that you're allowing the layers to dry completely before going back in order to avoid any accidents that then you're not going to be able to correct. Okay, so after having gotten that very important information out of the way that hopefully helps you in future landscapes that you paint using watercolor, let's go ahead and get started with painting the sky. And as you can see, I created my own color mixtures using the color sheets because the blues in the color sheets are very bright, very vibrant, and I wanted to tone it down a bit and make it look a little bit more realistic. So I brought in my knowledge of the color wheel and did a little bit of tweaking here and there of my color mixtures until I arrived at something that I liked for my landscape. For my first color, I mixed together peacock blue, Persian blue, and burnt sienna. And then, to add a little bit of variation in color in my sky, I decided to create a purple color. And what I did was I brought a little bit of this blue out into another well on my paint mixing palette, and I added a little tiny bit of crimson to this to make a nice purple. You can modify the color ratios in your mixtures as much as you'd like until you come up with a blue and bluish purple or purple color that you like, and then make sure that you test them out on a scrap piece of watercolor paper before actually using them in your painting. Alright, so I'm going to be using only one size 14 round brush for this entire painting. And because of this, I'm going to make sure to really rinse out my paintbrush bristles before going into the next color. So what I'm doing here is I'm going in with my blue color completely wet on dry, making sure that I created a nice variation in blues. I didn't go in super saturated right away. I made sure that some little sections here and there look more transparent. And if you notice, I even left some tiny sections of white paper shining through completely. And then once that blue had been placed, I then started dropping in my purple here and there just to add a little bit of interest and variation. I made sure to drop in both the blue and the purple very loosely in a very irregular way and really allowed the paint to do its own thing. Once the sky was finished, it was now time to move on to the grass areas in the middle ground and in the foreground. And for this, I created a mixture of sap green plus gold ochre. This first green that I placed had quite a bit of gold ochre in it because I wanted to make sure to go in with a nice light green. And once that initial lightest green layer had been placed, I then added more sap green into my green color mixture on my paint mixing palette to darken it even further, and dropped in this darker green into certain areas to add a little bit of dimension and variation into the grass sections. After that was done, I then moved on to painting the water section or the river. And this area of my painting, I approached wet on wet, meaning that I pre-wetted this area with clean water before actually dropping in my color. I took my time pre-wetting this area with my clean water, making sure that I arrived at a nice even sheen with no puddles before dropping in my color. That blue that I am using right there was created by mixing together peacock blue and black. Once again, I decided to add just a tiny bit of black into my blue to mute it out a little bit and make it look a little bit more natural. Just like with my grass areas and my sky, I am jumping around this area and dropping in my color very loosely, allowing the paint to do its own thing, and at the same time, thinking of creating a nice variation in lights to darks and in transparencies all throughout the area so that there is no flatness there. Once that initial layer of lightest blue had been placed, I then added even more of this color mixture only into certain areas that I wanted to darken. And you probably saw just a moment ago that I used my absorbent towel to do some lifting along the way, as well as the slightly dampened and clean bristles of my paintbrush as a sort of sponge to pick up some excess paint here and there. Alright, so it's time to get started with painting the tree line in the faraway distance. I really wanted to use a darker green for these trees in the faraway distance, so I mixed together some sap green plus a little bit of Persian blue. I then removed all of the paint from my paintbrush bristles, and as you can see, we are approaching these trees wet on wet. This means that once again, we're going in to pre-wet the area with clean water before dropping in our paint. And the reason why I wanted to do this is because I wanted those trees to blur out into the sky and create a nice undefined look. This is going to help us add depth to our painting. Once that initial layer of sap plus a little bit of Persian blue had been added in, I then added even more Persian blue into the green color mixture to darken it even further, and dropped in this second darker green only in certain areas. So as you can see, I end up with a tree line that is blurring out and that has a variety of greens inside. Some of the greens are lighter and some of the greens are darker. At this point, I allowed everything to dry completely, and once everything was dry, I started painting in the tree that is closer to us in the middle ground. So I created even more green plus Persian blue color mixture to darken that green from the color sheets a tiny bit and make it look a little bit more natural. And once that green color mixture was ready, I very loosely pre-wetted the entire section of leaves in this tree, making sure that I was painting in a very irregular organic shape with my clean water. Also make sure that there are tiny sections in which you're able to see the background and the sky through the leaves. That's gonna make your tree look a lot more believable. Once that initial layer of green had been placed, I then add even more Persian blue into my green color mixture to darken it even further. And as you can see, I only drop in this darker green into certain sections. And because the previous layer of paint is still wet, this darker green is dissipating very beautifully into the lighter green. After painting in the leaves for this tree, I allowed everything to dry once again, and it was now time to paint in the tree trunk and the branches. And the color mixture that I used to paint in these areas was created by mixing together burnt sienna and a tiny bit of slate black. I made sure that the first brown that I laid down had just a tiny little bit of slate black, and that it was mostly a light brown. And once that light brown had been placed, I then went in and added a tiny bit more of slate black into the color mixture to darken it even further, and use this darker brown only in certain areas. After finishing up with the tree trunk and the branches, it was time to add a little bit of a grass effect here and there. And I really wanted to make sure that I use a green that was at least a bit darker than the greens that we have already used in the grass areas. So what I did was I used the sap green plus Persian blue color mixture that I had been using for the leaves in the closer tree to us and the trees in the faraway distance. But just to make sure that I didn't go in with a very dark color mixture and made those blades of grass way too stark looking, I made sure to add more sap green into the color mixture to get it a little bit closer to the lightness of the green that is already in these areas. I then jumped around from section to section, laying down little abstract organic shapes and actually doing little flicking motions with my wrist to create those blades of grass. Make sure that you keep everything very organic, very irregular, and really less is more oftentimes. There's no need to go overboard with the amount of grass that you paint in. All right, so with that done, there are just a couple of steps left. First, I go in to further darken some little tiny areas along the tree trunk and the branches with an even darker version of my brown by adding just a little bit more of slate black into my brown color mixture. And just a moment ago, I also darkened a few little tiny areas here and there in the water area by going in with the darkest blue color mixture that I used for the water. I allow everything to dry and I remove all of the masking fluid from my painting. As you can see, I am left with little white areas that have been masked out, blocked out completely. And oftentimes, when we use masking fluid, we may want to go in and soften some of those edges in some of these very stark looking white shapes. So what I do is I go in with a light and translucent version of whatever color it is that I used to paint in that area. I then run my paintbrush bristles along the edges of the shapes that I want to soften out, or even paint in a larger area of that shape. Because we're painting a landscape, I take this opportunity to add even a little bit more grass with this lighter and more translucent green. As you can see, this makes those stark looking shapes look a lot less obvious. All right, everybody, that is it for today's tutorial. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful and were able to follow along. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and tell us in the comments what you'd like to see next. Thank you so very much for watching today and have a beautiful rest of the day. Bye guys!